Spyro the Dragon is a colorful, fun, and ambitious game. It tackled 3D with grace. It employed the classic collectathon genre with a beautiful execution. It was a change of pace from the 2D and 2.5D platformers that were common in the day. They decided to have a full-on 3D platformer with emphasis on collecting the items rather than defeating the enemies. It would be one of the few mascots that would compete for attention with the likes of Mario, Link, and other Nintendo giants. Spyro had a large effect on the gaming of the era, but is its effect one that can last beyond the generation it was born into? Does this game stand the test of time? Today we'll find out on this episode of Bridging the Gap. We're going to be rating Spyro the Dragon with the 5 pillars of a good game, being difficulty, where we will identify how well balanced the game's difficulty is, graphics, where we will look at how well the art style and in-game recognizability of the graphics hold up, conveyance, where we will look at how well we know what to do and where to go in the game, story/progression, where we will see how satisfying it is to progress further in the game, and replayability, where we will see if the game has any lasting value for a second playthrough. Pillar 1. Difficulty. Spyro struggled a bit on the balancing of the difficulty. They built a super solid game with super solid mechanics, but the introduction to each of them isn't the best balanced. I feel like most of the unbalanced difficulty, though, is less the fault of the developers and more the fault of the technology. I can't count the times I couldn't dodge a hit, or couldn't avoid falling, or just couldn't nail a jump because the camera controls were so unintuitive to use that I just couldn't see what I was trying to do. That doesn't seem like something that I should pin on the developers, because camera controls weren't really hammered down until halfway through the PS2, GameCube, original Xbox generation. The camera controls used are basically the same as every other 3D game of the generation, which is to say absolute garbage. I can't completely fault them, because the controller that Spyro was designed for didn't even have analog sticks. You can't use the better tool for cameras if the better tool isn't present. The other moments that I don't feel are totally balanced are mainly the final boss and certain select areas throughout the game. I'll focus on the final boss for the examples though. It asks you to use a mechanic with mastery, this being dashing, that the rest of the game doesn't require you to master. There are moments where you are asked to work on it, but none of them are really mandatory. The completionist in me went after these situations, but I can see why someone else who was a bit more casual might have skipped a lot of it. For these reasons, I can't give it too much past a 6 for difficulty.
Some of the enemies are harder than others. You have to use different strategies for different enemies, and some of them are more difficult to pull off. This, combined with clunky controls and somewhat difficult platforming, can make for some intense challenges. For these reasons, I leave it with a 7.
Pillar 2. Graphics. Where the difficulty might struggle a bit, the graphics I feel are super solid. The art style of Spyro would go on to be iconic. There are drawbacks to having such ambitious graphics on early hardware though. Anything that sits more than maybe 10 meters in front of the player is undetailed and plastic looking. The lower texture strategies of competing systems I feel like did it a little better for distance, but it is something you definitely notice on Spyro. It wouldn't necessarily be something I would bring up if it wasn't so distracting from the detailed textures that you see at closer distances. There's this bubble around Spyro of high detail, and a whole world around him of flat colors. Again though, I can't rail on the graphics too much because they don't ever need you to interact with something at those distances. The only parts of the world you have to interact with are the areas with higher detail. It's always the background portion of the world that has these super low quality textures. With all of this being said, I leave graphics with a 7.
It's pretty easy to tell the difference between different platforms throughout the world. The graphics stay distinct enough for easy identifiability. That is, of course, if you can get the camera in the right spot. Everything from enemies to pickups are distinct and identifiable. For this, I give it an 8.
Pillar 3. Conveyance. Spyro doesn't have 2D platformer level of conveyance, but it does have super simple conveyance. Collect treasure, save dragons, defeat Gnasty Gnorc. There isn't really anything else that you need to know to understand your goal. The game leaves the player to explore past the simple hints that the opening gives you and that the dragons give you when you save them. It's a game that lets the player explore, but never leaves the character without some feeling of direction. It gives more direction than something like the original Zelda, but leaves the character with more exploration than something like Mario. It's a good middle ground that I really enjoyed. I leave Conveyance with an 8, all things considered.
Levels can be a bit confusing sometimes, but the overall goal is pretty simple. You collect, and collect, and collect, and don't die while you collect. There's not too much that is complicated with collectathons. I'll give it a 7.
Pillar 4. Story/progression. The story is pretty simple. The dragons feel like Gnasty Gnorc is a threat, but then he turns them all into statues and turns their treasure into monsters. Spyro was the only dragon missed, so it's up to him to save all the dragons and collect the treasure. The game doesn't have a crazy story, but for a collectathon it's not really needed. You just need to know what to do pretty much, and for this, saving dragons and collecting treasure is enough. Everyone knows I'm a sucker for a complex story, but I love a simple one just as well. With everything being as satisfying as it is for progression, I'll leave it at a 7.
The story is kinda weird. Other than that, it's pretty simple. You go world to world throughout the game, and eventually complete them all. I leave it with a 7.
Pillar 5. Replayability. I feel like, as I do with most older games, the flaws of Spyro are able to be overlooked with multiple playthroughs. Yes, there are things wrong with the game, but when you know how to deal with each of the flaws, you know how to enjoy the end product that much better. I can't get it too high though, because none of the worlds are particularly memorable, past maybe the Artisan world and the Dreamweaver's world. For the uninitiated, that's the very first world, and basically the last world. The massive middle chunk of the game was kind of blah in some ways. I still leave it with a 7 though.
I probably won't return to the game, but not because it's a bad game. It's just because collectathons aren't my games of choice. It is a solid game though. It gets a 6 from me.
In conclusion, Spyro the Dragon was a good game that most definitely stood the test of time. There were things that didn't work super well, but it received a remake that fixed basically all of the issues with the game. It had updated camera controls, made textures a uniform quality, and fixed a few other minor things. No remake is perfect though, and Spyro is no exception. The art style was sacrificed for the remake of the game. Overall, I think that the game deserves a little better than what it has received for preservation. It needs to be more accessible to more people. I rail on Nintendo for this all the time, And now it's Sony's turn. I get generational exclusives, but why are your retro titles still exclusive? Bring them to PC. Bring them to mobile OS like Android and iOS. Make them more accessible to more people. People want to have good retro games that don't require finding aging hardware or legally questionable emulation to play. Spyro has it better than most, but I still don't think it's good enough. Well, everyone, this has been Melting Data and Dark Crusader. Find the Balloonist and meet us in the next video.